Well, welcome back to the Collector's Attic. That must mean it's Tuesday.
It is.
Yes. This week we are featuring a Delton locomotive, a Delton brass locomotive. Back in the 1970s, when garden railroading started to take off, LGB, Lehman Grossbahn, hit the United States, and they got a bunch of stores, importers and stuff, and it popped up in the stores. It had been around in Germany, and suddenly everybody wanted large-scale trains that they could run out in their garden. It just really took off, and it was a thing. And most people were building it outdoors.
Of course.
Because it fits outdoors. It's very difficult to fit these large trains inside. But then there were a few people who said, gee, I want to do that indoors, and I want to do it the same way I would do HO. I want super detail.
Wow.
I want brass locomotives. I want wood structures. I want the whole thing. So that started to sort of emerge. And about that time, this guy popped up on the market, the Delton brass locomotives. Delton was a U.S. company making engines in the United States, which even by then they'd started moving to Korea. Since the 1950s, they'd been assembled in Japan because there's so much, these are all hand assembled by people, soldered together, very meticulous, very slow, and done in very, very limited editions. So
yeah, I'm speechless.
And so they tend to be very expensive and therefore very collectible because there just were never that many made. This is the very first one they did, Mason Bogie number 15 off the Denver South Park and Pacific. Ran on a number 1 gauge track. And they went on to do several other engines. They did a Cook 260 and some other engines. The guy that came up with this was a guy by the name of Phil Jensen.
Oh.
And he's been talked about extensively. But he thought that there needed to be brass locomotives done in the large scales, in this case half-inch scale.
Okay.
And so he started producing these, and this Breckenridge is his very first engine, the very first one that he made, and then several more. His goal was to make something other than brass. He wanted to come out with an affordable plastic engine that had brass detail to it, and at a really affordable price, something that would be down in the $400 to $500 range.
Okay.
Not the $4,000 to $5,000 range.
Wow. Yeah. No kidding.
And he set about to do that, and he actually was able to do that, and that will be next week's show. As a matter of fact, we're going to talk about the locomotive he managed to come up with. At any rate, Delton came out with a line of brass engines. The first, as far as I know, the first brass engines done to a 1/2 inch scale. And that was a popular scale at that time. It's completely died since then. Still runs on the same track, number 1 gauge track, and I'm putting a link up here so that if you want to look at the video on scales and gauges, it'll help explain that.
I'll have to watch that again because I still get lost.
Yeah, well, the darn thing's half-hour long too, and people drop over dead from boredom. At any rate, it's informative at least, and we'll explain. But all of this stuff ran on the same track, a number 1 gauge track, which is 1 3/4 inch between the rails. And the LGB trains were done to a 1/22 scale. They started doing a few American prototypes to that same scale. Technically, a 3-foot gauge American train should have been done to 1/20.3 scale to make them correct. But nobody was doing that in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. It wasn't until later, until the 21st century, that someone said, why aren't we doing that? And they just switched everything over to 20.3 scale, and everything's being done now in 20.3 scale, killing the 1/2 inch scale, which everybody was doing before. It's actually way too small. The appropriate gauge for a 1/2 inch scale train would have been only 1.5 inches, not 1 3/4 inches. At any rate, what we have here is the very first Delton brass locomotive that they made. They did this little guy. It comes in a wood box with a wood lid, and this one's sort of carefully packed in here so that it doesn't get damaged.
Oh boy.
We hope it doesn't get damaged. These are some spare parts.
Oh.
And this is some additional packing material. Oh my.
Oh dear.
Let's see if I can get this to come out now. Arr.
Oh,
The Breckenridge. This is a type of locomotive called a Mason Bogie. And the Mason Bogie was similar to an articulated locomotive. They ran on the Denver South Park and Pacific. And it has an articulated front section similar to what you'd find on an articulated locomotive like the Big Boy. But in this case, it's just a small, straightforward, narrow gauge engine. They articulated this so that it could get through stupidly sharp turns and this whole thing. But because this whole front engine rotates, the valve gear and everything became quite a problem. And they came up with this whole elaborate rig here for the valve gear and the reversing mechanism and all of that. It had to go over the boiler and down the other side, because they needed to run it from the center of the pivot point on the articulated section. Now with something like a Big Boy, by then they'd figured out things like power reversers that ran off the steam pressure. This is all mechanical back when these locomotives were out in the 19th century. And so because it's all mechanical, it has to have this incredibly elaborate mechanism.
that's crazy. Wow.
But what a beautiful job Delton did on these. Now, if this were in the 120.3 scale, it would be about that much longer and about that tall. It would be considerably larger. I sort of like the half-inch scale engines because they are a little bit smaller, and that makes them a little bit easier to manage. And,
Dare I
and
say
so
it's
on.
cute?
You can say it's cute. You have my permission to say it's cute, because I actually think it's cute.
Oh, it's charming.
Now, nobody knows what color the Breckenridge was painted off the Denver South Park and Pacific. I think there's a satellite flying over. Okay. At any rate, they painted this kind of wine color with some red accents because a lot of locomotives were painted in those colors. Nobody wrote down the color of the Breckenridge. It's kind of debatable, and there's a lot of people arguing back and forth. Now, when Delton came out with this guy, they painted the majority of them. I believe there was 150 when painted in this color, and about 10 that were painted other colors or left bare brass. And this one is serial number 75.
So that's the
Yeah, this is the 75th one. Some of the colors people chose to have the custom painting done in white, blue,
The
just
baby
crazy, crazy weird.
Yeah.
Anyway, I love the red.
I do too.
Some people have said, well, it isn't right, and I know it isn't right because I can see in black and white. And blah, 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 blah. But it's beautiful.
It's
I don't know if
beautiful.
it's correct. I don't know that anybody knows if it's correct. There's a wide assumption that it's not correct. Doesn't matter. It's a beautiful engine.
beautiful.
The Breckenridge has been modeled quite extensively in other scales. This guy, when it came out at $1,800, which in the 1970s money was a considerable.
You buy a car.
Yeah,
My
that was
mom bought her Vega brand new for not much more than that.
true. Yeah, in 1970s dollars, this was, and I saw these when they first came out. I saw one at Caboose Hobbies in Denver. They had to clean the glass when I left because it was drool, and I just, I have to have it. Can you pay for it? Well, of course
No.
not. That's ridiculous. Now, fortunately, over the years, I've found a few more dollars laying around, and for whatever reason, these have become much more affordable. A lot of brass engines have not held their value very well, which is weird.
It's crazy.
For the longest time, brass engines were even an investment. They go up in value and become more collectible.
Oh yeah.
So these can now be picked up for $1,000 to $1,100, something like that. So they've actually gone down in value. Never mind that paying $1,850 for one of these in 1970s money, adjusted for inflation, you'd be paying well over $10,000 for
Yeah,
it
just
today.
add a zero onto the end
Yeah,
of that whole
it'd
show.
be something like
Yeah.
$14,000-15,000. So I
Yeah.
mean, nobody could afford them back then.
No.
A few people did, which is why they're out there.
Right.
But now they've, because of the strangeness of collecting, that not everything goes up in value, they've become somewhat affordable. Difficult to find.
Yeah.
There's 180 painted, and there's 10 painted in other colors, and or in bare brass, as I recall. At any rate, very fascinating. Delton went on to make several other locomotives, perhaps 4 other locomotives in brass, because not a lot of people could afford them, and but some people did. And anyway, here's one right here.
Isn't that cute? Oh,
Isn't that just an
it looks
amazing?
like jewelry, really. I mean, you could
It reminds me of the locomotives at Disneyland,
a little bit, yeah.
because it kind of has that
It's
same quality
whimsical
and the
and-
paint job and everything. Wouldn't it be fun to time travel back to the Como Roundhouse? We did that show on the Como Roundhouse. This is one of the locomotives that would have been serviced at the Como Roundhouse, and how amazing it would have been to see this in somewhere around 1880s, 1890s, when these
There were
things
time travel.
were running around out there, and even earlier.
Wow.
At any rate, there it is. Well, if you haven't been over to the channel, do pop on over to the channel and subscribe. And the way you can get over there is to, I'm getting ahead of myself, is to click on the blue button. Are you ready for it? Zoink! Right there, that blue button. If you don't see it, you may have to turn your phone, or your device just might
I
not
can
support it.
stand on my head, but
You can find your way over there by just navigating Toyman Television on YouTube and then subscribe that way. Zoink! If the blue button's there, just click on it and it solves all of those problems easily. And most devices support it, but not all, sadly.
I've been doing it the hard way all these years.
Well, we're not sure how you found this particular movie on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring. And we will see you here again on Sunday with the Driving Around show. We'll see you then.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.